All right, so I want to show you this process called factoring by grouping. It's kind of a weird thing to see, but it's part of a bigger process. So my goal is, we've got like these 5 or 6 different steps that we're going to wind up doing. The factoring by grouping is the last couple of steps. So I'm kind of doing this a little bit backwards because I want you guys to be able to do the last part of this. So when we get on to factoring a trinomial, we can focus on the first few steps, which are the more complicated ones. So then once we get those first couple of steps done, the rest of it's just, it's stuff we've done before. So this is going to look a little weird going into it, but just have a little faith in me is all I ask. So these polynomials that I'm showing you, they're going to look a little strange because these two terms in the middle could be combined, right? I could have the negative 36 and the 35 and get a negative 1b out of that. That's not the point of factoring. We're not going to put terms together when we factor. We're going to pull terms apart. So in able to factor this by grouping, I actually need it. I need 4 terms because I'm going to cut this thing in half. I'm literally, my tab will shut off. I'm literally going to draw a line down the middle of this thing, and I'm going to do a greatest common factor on the left side and the greatest common factor on the right side. And it kind of looks a little magic that this happens, but it's not. So what I need here is I need the greatest common factor for 30b squared and negative 36b. So basically 30 and 36 are both divisible by 6, and both of these terms have a b, so I'm also going to divide out a b. Now when I do that, I'm left with a binomial, which would be 5b minus 6. Okay, the left-hand side is done. Okay, greatest common factor, and then you move on to the right. So the right-hand side, 35 and 42. I'm going to divide out the greatest common factor for 35 and 42. Notice there's no variable on 42, so I don't have to worry about a variable coming out on the second half. So both of these guys are divisible by 7, and I'm going to put a plus in here. You'll see why in a second. So I divided out a positive 7. If you divide out a negative, I would have had a negative 7. So when I divide out a 7, I'm left with 5b minus 6. Now, if you notice, this first binomial and this second binomial should be the same, okay? If they're not the same for some reason, you probably didn't pull out the biggest common factor, or maybe you just divided wrong. So what's left in your parentheses there, your factors, should be the same. So since the left-hand side and the right-hand side have that in common, and I said that I put the emphasis on common there, I'm going to pull that out front as a greatest common factor. And what I'm left with are the pieces that were in front as my multipliers, 6b plus 7. Now, way back, when we multiplied binomials together, I tried to explain it in a way that you take this whole binomial times 6b, right, when you distribute. It's going to cut out on me now. 5b minus 6. And then I take, this whole binomial times 7, so it'll be plus 7, 5b minus 6. I showed you guys that one time, and then I showed you a different way to do it because that's kind of a long way to do it, and I tried to keep things short as possible. So what we're doing is we're kind of taking this bigger trinomial, this big polynomial, and breaking it up into its pieces. So this is what we're looking for. Okay, greatest common factor on the left, greatest common factor on the right. The common factor is 5b minus 6, so I can pull that out front like you would any other greatest common factor. And then, excuse me, the multipliers that were out front are going to drop down into a second binomial. So what I wind up with are 2 binomial factors for this big polynomial that we started with at the beginning. Okay, like I said, it's kind of weird. Have a little faith in me. You do a couple of these and you'll start to see some things where it really kind of makes sense what's happening. All right, cut this guy in half. You always cut it in half. Right after the second term, draw a line. The line's there to help me keep organized. You don't have to draw a line. I just think it's helpful. So 4r squared and a minus r, those are both divisible by r. Right? No number can divide out, so that's going to leave me 4r minus 1. Okay, r divided by r is 1. The second half, 32r plus 8. Those are both divisible by 8. So I'm going to put a plus 8. Now this second half, there's a couple of things you kind of need to watch out for, and we just haven't hit one yet. The second half of this, when you start looking right here, if that is a negative term, you're going to need to divide out the negative. I know a couple of you have asked me, hey, is the greatest common factor ever negative? Well, greatest means biggest, so negatives don't really kind of go with that. If you can take out a positive number, that's obviously bigger than a negative number. But in order to make our factors here match, sometimes you'll have to divide out a negative, and it is always, if that second half starts negative, you divide out a negative. If it starts positive, divide out a positive. All right, so what I'm left with here, the 4r minus 1 comes out front, and the r plus 8 is my other factor. Now, technically, those two, it doesn't matter which one comes first, r plus 8, 4r minus 1, because they're interchangeable because we're multiplying. That's the process. It's pretty much just wash, rinse, repeat. I'm going to divide both of these guys by 7x. Another thing you might notice is the first half of this, there's always a variable you can divide out. The second half of it, there's not a variable that you can divide out. So again, it starts out negative, so I'm going to divide out that negative. And what that does is it switches the sign. Whoops, should have. I screwed it up. It switches the sign on. Instead of being a positive 5, it's now a negative 5. That way it matches the first term. If I hadn't divided out this negative here, my x term would have been negative, and my 5 would have been positive, so it doesn't match the first one. Kind of taking out your negative takes care of that. So x minus 5 is my common factor out front. 7x minus 3 is my other. These don't change. They don't get much harder. The only thing is really just the numbers that you're dealing with. Some of the numbers might be a little bit bigger, and if you're not real comfortable with your multiplication facts, it might be kind of a challenge. The only thing I can divide out here is n. Speaking of not being comfortable with your multiplication facts, you can kind of use the first half to help you figure out the second half. If you don't know what to divide out of 56 and 21, but you know the second half is supposed to be 8n plus 3, right? Because it should match the first half. Maybe you could use that to help you figure out what you should have divided out. In this case, I need to divide out a negative. And then what do you multiply by 50? I'm sorry, what do you divide 56 by to get 8? Oh, there's your 7. Okay. So 8n plus 3, and then n minus 7. Again, the things to look out for, if the second half starts negative, right? If this is a negative right here, you've got to divide out a negative number at the beginning. Okay. If your two sets of parentheses don't match, you maybe didn't divide out the greatest common factor. Just a couple of things to look out for. We're going to spend a day or two practicing this before we kind of make it part of a bigger process.